Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So today being the 25th of October, it's the centenary of Terence MacSwiney's death. So in case you don't know who he was Lord Mayor of Cork. That's the third biggest city in Ireland. And he committed suicide in Brixton Prison. He starved himself to death. Now, most Irish people are nationalists of some stripe, and most of them wouldn't say it's suicide. MacSwiney was an ardent Catholic. Obviously, suicide is forbidden in all forms of Christianity, and the Catholic Church particularly detests it, wouldn't allow suicides to have a funeral, be buried in consecrated ground until recent decades. So the Catholic Church had to contort itself into pretending that deliberately not eating when you're offered food all the time is not suicide. An inaction is as much of a choice as an action. Um, anyway, so Terence MacSwiney wanted to die, and therefore he deserves less sympathy than anybody else who was killed in that 1919 to 21 conflict. But he garnered a great deal of sympathy around the world. It just shows how illogical most people are, how willfully asinine many people are to empathize with him. And he's the only one who died in that conflict who actually wanted to die. He got his wish. So why would you feel sorry for him? I mean, even if you completely endorse his cause, you might approve of what he did, but why would you feel sorrowful as his wish was granted? He tried to kill himself and he achieved that. He wasn't force fed, which it could have been, and the prison authorities had force fed people previously, had desisted from doing so. I think it was Thomas Ashe who was accidentally died from force feeding in 1917. But force feeding obviously saved far more lives than it took. Ergo, it was humane to continue. You might think somebody's mentally ill before deliberately refusing to eat nutrition, and therefore you'd have to treat this person against his or her will on the basis the person's not compos mentis. Now, I don't think there are any doubts about MacSwiney's sanity. He was mentally sound. He knew what he was doing. He was doing this in furtherance of a political cause. So Terence MacSwiney was born in Cork in 1879. He grew up in the North Main Street. There's a plaque there. He was born to an Irish father and an English mother, Catholic on both sides. His father had wanted to join the Pontifical Army, go over in the 1860s to fight for the Papal State. Remembering the Papal States, I should say. Remember, to the mid-19th century, the Pope ruled central Italy, not just Rome, a large chunk of Italy. So he was very much a political leader as well as a religious one, and not of a micro state like today, but a serious amount of territory. Irish nationalism obviously is mainly a Catholic thing. People tend to forget that the Catholic Church was completely against nationalism, any nationalism, well into the 19th century, preferred these sort of pre-national dynastic or feudal states, and the Papal State being no exception. So the Catholic Church was the sworn enemy of Italian nationalism and republicanism in any country, preferred monarchies. Anathematized Garibaldi, who's now the sort of icon of nationalism in Italy and for other nationalist movements. MacSwiney's father, he was quite well to do. I can't remember what, he had some sort of factory for a while, but then that went bust. He left the family emigrated to Australia. So Terence MacSwiney, from a young age, grew up with the child of a single parent. He went to the North Monastery School. The North Mon is well known in Cork, and then University College Cork. You've got to remember that very, very few people around the turn of the 20th century went on to tertiary education. So he was a man of attainments, as he was described. He was a prolific writer, a journalist. He wrote a play called The Revolutionist. It's an alternative to revolutionary. And he wrote on ethics and so on. And he argued that it was morally justified for a Catholic to rebel against an unjust government, and he claimed that the United Kingdom, Ireland being part of the United Kingdom, that was unjust, and therefore it was permissible to take up arms against the said authority. So he composed numerous poems. So far as I know, he only ever wrote in English. I'm not aware he could actually speak Irish at all. Cork being very much an Anglophone city at the time, and he published a magazine, Fianna Fáil, in 1914, just after the First World War broke out, but it was closed down by the censor after about 8 editions for being seditious and so on, causing disaffection to His Majesty, being liable to spread defeatism and despondency. Because in 1914 in Cork, there was a huge outpouring of patriotism, British patriotism, and some hardline Republicans were aghast to see people they'd regarded as passionate Republicans being British nationalists, waving the Union flag and so on, and being all for this cause of the United Kingdom, as in including Ireland. Obviously, support for that leached away as the casualties mounted and the war dragged on with no end in sight, and civil liberties were curtailed, as is always necessitated by a major war situation. The Easter Rising broke out in Dublin, and the Irish volunteers had been tying themselves in knots with orders, and orders being countermanded because the failure of the German arms from the Ord to arrive, Roger Casement's arrest at Banner Strand. But anyway, so Terence MacSwiney was senior in the Irish Volunteers, later called the Irish Republican Army in Cork, and he holed up in Volunteer Hall. There was a tense standoff for a few days. The Bishop of Cork interceded, and MacSwiney was persuaded to lay down his arms. So it was an ignominious capitulation. If he wanted to fight, he could have fought. If he didn't want to march to the top of the hill, then he needn't have done that. And not having this silly standoff, might even be allowed to keep some of his weapons. He could have taken to the wilderness and fought there. But see, there was 100% casualties, with not a shot fired, with not a single casualty inflicted on the Crown forces, as in he and his men all laying down their arms. And don't tell me it was because he wanted to avert bloodshed. He certainly didn't, as we'll see a bit later on. So he was released from prison after a few months for that. And that just shows the exceptional magnanimity of the authorities at the time. The government was very, very lenient. Where in the world, in the midst of the First World War, would people be let out of prison for participation in an armed rebellion, except in the United Kingdom? Now, I know his men hadn't actually opened fire, but they were part of that conspiracy with the Irish Volunteers. It was really this shadowy Irish Republican Brotherhood beneath it all, orchestrating it all. Would you have been let off with just a slap on the wrist? This was the most unexampled liberality, showed just how humane the UK was. And was he grateful for the ruth that had been shown him? Not one bit of it. In many other countries, he'd been executed for far less. And he was wearing IRA uniform in 1917 when he was arrested, and again, he got a very mild sentence. One of his times out of prison, he'd married a rich lady, Miss Murphy, I think, from the brewing family. They had one daughter who only died about 8 years ago. Rather wish I'd met her, actually. So anyway, he was in this new political party called Sinn Féin. It's based on this reflexive pronoun, ourselves alone, and the name is indicative of their isolationist and xenophobic stance. But he was elected Lord Mayor of Cork because Cork, around 1900, when Queen Victoria visited, she'd given us the title Lord Mayor for our mayor, not just simply mayor. But despite being an anti-monarchist, he didn't start himself simply mayor. I mean, if being part of the UK is so dreadful, if the monarchy should have nothing to do with Ireland, why on earth would you accept the prefix Lord to your mayoral title? Anyhow, so he was arrested because there was this conflict from January the 19th, 1919 to the 10th of July, 1921, between the Crown Forces and the IRA. But he was arrested in early 1920 in possession of documents, as was said, likely to cause disaffection to His Majesty, something to do with the IRA or Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin had been proclaimed because really Sinn Féin and the IRA had more or less blended into the same body, and the distinction between them was lost even in the minds of their members sometimes, calling themselves Sinn Féin volunteers and so forth, calling the Irish tricolour the Sinn Féin flag. Obviously, we already had an Irish flag, St Patrick's blue, or you could even do it as green, a version of the flag of Leinster. Leinster at times was almost a synecdoche for Ireland. So he was sent to Brixton Prison in London, and there he went on hunger strike. So people interceded with him, tried to persuade him to end his death fast. He declined to do so, saying, "My death will do more to smash the British Empire than my release." And so it was reported around the world, and a lot of people felt for him, which is obviously ludicrous and utterly moronic. He wasn't the only person who got killed in that conflict. Thousands of people got killed in that conflict, a great number of them by his organisation, often civilians, often members of the Crown Forces who were killed unarmed, the IRA engaging in internecine sectarian warfare in Northern Ireland, killing a lot of Protestant civilians, and these barbaric loyalist terrorist organizations slaughtering lots of Catholic civilians as well. So these people deserve sympathy. A lot of innocent victims, even members of the IRA, or if you're an IRA supporter, even members of the Crown Forces. They didn't want to get killed. They're willing to run the risk of being killed, but they didn't actually want to die. He did want to die, so his wish was granted. Anyway, so he lost consciousness after 69 days on hunger strike. He went on hunger strike for release. And now some IRA men said, you have to recognize us as prisoners of war. And obviously the government didn't, because they say, well, you're not fighting on the behalf of a legally constituted state. No, you don't obey the Geneva Convention. You don't wear uniforms. You don't carry your arms openly quite a lot of the time. Often don't have a command structure. You don't take prisoners yourself. You usually kill the people you capture, and on and on. So no, we're not going to do that. And obviously the IRA were very, very leniently treated, usually simply interned. Occasionally they're beaten up, but very, very few of them executed. At this time, 1924, about 24 IRA men executed. That's roughly 1 in 1,000 of those who were arrested. So obviously, some people were killed shortly after their capture because they tried to run away or grab weapons off their guards, or arguably, allegedly, simply killed out of hand by the police or the army. I don't dismiss all those allegations. Some of that could be true. Anyway, so he died in prison after 74 days, and he had his funeral in Southwark. But the Crown Forces, I suppose, should have simply buried his body in prison, quitclime, and just not allowed the IRA to exploit this for the purpose of inflaming feeling and making the conflict even worse. So he had some sort of funeral requiem at Southwark Cathedral in London. His body was due to be shipped to Bolia, but it wasn't sent to Dublin. The authorities decided to go to Cork, indeed his hometown. There's a song about him, Will My Soul Pass Through Ireland? But anyway, out at the North Cathedral, he had his funeral mass, and I've seen that Sir John Lavery painting of his of his coffin being borne aloft, and the cathedral is very dimly lit, but his coffin is draped in the tricolour, and the green is a dark yet brilliant green. It's transfiguration white for the central bar, and the saffron third of it again is absolutely glowing. And I'm sure there's a message in that it's refulgent compared to the rest of the ill-lit place of worship. So he's laid to rest in St Finbarr's cemetery in Cork, and I was there just a few months ago. So he said it's not those who can inflict the most, those who can suffer the most, who will conquer. Well, I suppose that was proved to be true in the case of the Crown Forces in the recent Northern Ireland conflict, the sort of 1969 to 98 conflict, as the Crown Forces took so many casualties and killed very few people. I remember some British general in the 90s saying, our aim is not to kill people, but to make sure as few people as possible are killed. Like in Northern Ireland, the Crown Forces haven't killed anybody since about 1994, not one person. And how many people have been killed by Republican terrorists or loyalist terrorists since then, since 94? Be a couple of hundred, I would think. So just shows just how restrained, how ethical, how gallant the Crown Forces are. Well, that's my penny's worth on MacSwiney. Now, he was unafraid of death, so in that sense, you have to say, yes, he was valiant, he was sincere, he clearly believed in his cause, but I'm not obliged to agree with his cause one whit, simply because I happen to be born in the same city as him, and I know members of my family are outspoken admirers of his. So that's it. He had his life, he chose to die for something, but I don't have to agree with that at all. It'd be much better if he hadn't done that sort of thing, and we could just say part of the United Kingdom. Anyway, so that's my take on Terence MacSwiney. Toodaloo.